Okay, so for this final part of our tutorial, we're just going to do an intro into continue, break, and return statements. And these are just extra little parts we can add in that will kind of help us skip parts of the code. So this allows us to exit loops early, or we can kind of continue on to the next loop iteration depending on what we use. So continues allow us to skip parts of the loop, whereas breaks and returns allow us to exit the loop or the function entirely. But we'll get more into detail in the tutorial. Okay, so now we're going to look at 3 different ways we can kind of continue or exit out of loops. One is going to be called a continue statement, so I'm just going to put these in a comment. One's going to be a continue, one's going to be a break, and one's going to be a return. And I'm going to talk about where each one might be useful and the difference between the 3. So the first one is going to be the continue statement. So let's just set up a loop. I'm just going to create a variable I. I'm going to set this to 0 to start off with. And I'm going to create a while loop, and so the condition is going to be as long as I is less than, let's say, 5. And let's have, first we'll have, actually let's have another variable, call this count, and it's going to be 0 for now. We're just going to have count plus equals I. Not 1, we want I. And then we want I plus equals 1, and that ensures it only runs 5 times, and we'll just print out value of, actually, you know what, I don't even need to print out the value of count, I can just have it be displayed here. Okay, so this ends up having the value of 10, and that's because what we're doing is we're starting at I of 0, and we're adding 1 to, we're basically saying count is going to be whatever I currently is, plus this new value, so it starts at 1, it starts at 0, and then it goes to 1, then plus 2, so that's 3, then plus 3, that's 6, then plus 4, that's 10, and then it exits when I is 5. So again, only runs until I is less than 5, and then it exits. Each time it's just adding whatever the value of I is to count, and it's increasing I by 1. However, what if we wanted to only add together the odd numbers? Well, there's a way we can do that with what we call the continue statement. So the continue statement basically just kind of tells the loop to stop what it's doing, stop executing the code, and just start the next iteration. So if we do something like if we say I mod 2 equals 1, so maybe we only want the odd ones, or let's say we only want to add the even ones together. So this, if for those of you who haven't seen this is a modulo operator, and or the modulus operator, and this just kind of helps us find a remainder. So by calling this I mod 2 equals 1, and you'll see this a lot throughout code, this is basically just testing to see if I is an odd number. If I is an odd number and we mod it by 2, which means we divide it by 2, then the remainder will always be 1 if it's an odd number. If it's an even number, then the remainder will be 0. Okay, so this just tests to see if I is odd. So if I is odd, we don't want to add it together, or we don't want to add it to anything. So we're just going to say continue. Okay, and this is basically just saying if I is odd, continue. So basically stop executing this code and start the next iteration of the loop. Okay, and it's kind of taking a while to run, not quite sure why it's being so slow. But yes, that's the gist of the continue statement. What this does is it kind of just stops executing anything else and performs the next iteration. So I guess we should put that in the if statement regardless, because this just kind of, if the continues here, then it doesn't really increase I by 1 each time. So continues you'll probably see more in for in loops than in while loops, but just because we're on the topic of the while loop, I wanted to add it in here. Okay, so the way this continue works is it's just saying that so in this case, if I is odd, then we'll just continue. So if I is an odd number, then we skip all of this code and then just move on to the next iteration. However, in our case, kind of I gets stuck because if I is odd, then we just continue, which means I never increases its count. But that's how a continue statement works, is it just stops executing anything after the continue and starts the next iteration of the loop. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this out for now. And now we'll talk about break statements. So break statements are just a way to exit out of an if statement or a while or a for in loop. So if we call break, that just exits the loop or the if statement regardless of anything. So if we say, or even a switch statement. So if we say something like, let's say we have this while loop while I is less than 5, and then we could do if I, if for some reason we wanted to leave early, if I equals 3, then break, and otherwise I plus equals 1. So now we get this loop only running 3 times. And the reason is because I is initialized to be 1 here, so it runs through once, and it tests this case. Well, I is not equal to 3, so we add 1. So now I is 1. Again, it tests the case, and I is still less than 5. It tests this case. No, it's not, so it adds 1 to it. Now I is 2. I is still less than 5, and this part, or this fails, so it goes again. And now this time I is equal to 3. It's still less than 5, so we still run the loop, but we perform this check to see if I is 3, and if it is, then we break. And that means that we just exit out of the loop without executing this code here. So that means that I stops its count at 3, and if we see, we get I equal to 3 at the end of it all. So once the loop's done, or rather the loop actually doesn't go to completion, it exits early because of this break statement. So that's where break statements are useful. We can include them in if statements, we can include them in loops. Very often it'll be some kind of a check to see if this condition is met, then we break, and it's basically just a way of exiting the loop or if statement or switch statement early if we kind of have some condition that once met we want to exit the loop early. Now the last one is going to be a return statement. Now we've seen functions that have different return types. So for example, if we have this function, sum function, and not taking in any parameters but has a return type of, say, string, then we have to, at the very end of it all, have return some kind of a string. Let's just say hello. So if we call some function, then we should just have hello being returned, and we do. So this is one type of return statement where we're returning a value. However, sometimes we'll not want to return any kind of value, but we want to exit out of everything, okay? And so that's where the return comes in handy, because if, for example, we add in this break statement in a while loop or in an if statement, then it exits out of the loop, but doesn't necessarily exit out of the function. So if I'm just going to cut this and change this to a void return type and just put it in. In fact, I'm going to keep that up. I'm just going to create some other function. So some other function. And there we go. Just going to add it in. And you know what? I'll add it in there as well, because I should keep the code that I'm typing out for you guys. Okay, there we go. Just going to comment out. So what's happening here is we've now put this while loop within this function. So if we call some other function, actually this should be some other function, then it performs this, it executes this loop, and it does the same thing as before, so then it breaks out of the loop, but we could have other code that's running regardless, so then we'd say something like print Mammoth Interactive. Okay, and as you can see, we still get the print statement running even though the while loop had this break. Now this is the difference between the break and returns, because they do similar things. They kind of exit early, but the break statement only exits out of loops and ifs and switch statements. So it only exits out of control flow, not out of the function. Whereas if we did this, then that would be something different. We no longer get Mammoth Interactive being printed out because we're calling return instead of break. Now return exits the function, whereas break exits the control flow. So that's the difference between the two. They're doing a similar thing in that they're exiting, but return, again, gets out of the function, whereas the break statement just kind of exits whatever control flow it's in. So it could be an if statement, could be a while loop. It just exits out of that. Okay, so that's the difference between the return and break. And we saw continue, although it was hard to see in this example. The continue statement basically just tells the loop to skip the current iteration if the continue is reached and go on to the next iteration. Okay, so that's continues, breaks, and returns. Again, just saying about the continue statements, it's just a way to kind of not exit the loop, but skip whatever this code is and go on to the next iteration. The break statements kind of help you to just exit out of some kind of a control flow early if we want. So if some condition is met, then we want to exit out of the loop. Whereas return statements allow us to exit out of a function prematurely. Okay, so if this condition is met, it just kind of, we call this return statement, and that exits out of the entire function rather than just the control flow. Okay, so that is breaks, continues, and returns. And that's pretty much all I'm going to introduce in this tutorial. There definitely is more to look into, but if I were to cover every topic to do with while loops and switch statements, we could be here for hours. So I urge you to kind of play around with this a little bit, see what other possibilities we can explore. With switch statements, we only looked at each case having one value, but you can have multiple values in each case, just separated with a comma. So in this way, we could test to see something like if, you know, the first case could be, we could have a string, and the first case could be maybe a character is equal to a vowel, so A, E, I, O, or U. And we could separate each of those with a comma and just have a bunch of different values to test in one case. Okay, so that's one thing. You can also test intervals within switch statements as well. So you just do that by giving a start and a finish value. Okay, so that's just one of the things you can do with switch statements. While loops, you know, they have pretty much endless possibilities because, again, it's just like a loop, just like a for in loop, but without the restriction on size. So we can kind of have this run as many times as we want. And the downside to that is that we can get stuck in these infinite loops if we're not careful, and that will cause you a lot of problems. It will probably crash your code and your program. Okay, so this last part will just be an outro, a summary of what we've learned so far. Otherwise, this is the continue, break, and return statements. And yeah, so we'll do the summary right away. And otherwise, hope you enjoyed it so far. Okay, so for this final part, we just gave you an intro into continue, break, and return statements. So continue statements, as a summary, kind of move on to the next loop iteration and skip all the code underneath. Whereas break and return statements are ways to exit out of loops and functions respectively. And yeah, so this just kind of gives you a way to exit out of a loop or a function once a condition is met if we don't want to go right to the end of the loop. So by now you should feel pretty comfortable using switch statements and while loops in your code. If there are still parts that you're unsure about, then I urge you to go back and check those out, and also compare switch statements to if statements and while loops to for in loops, because I think we kind of talked in a little more detail about if statements and for in loops, and the switch statements and while loops can be definitely compared to those pretty easily. So, you know, if you're still confused, it might be a good idea to go back and watch those videos also. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it. This next part coming up is just going to be kind of a summary and an outro of what we went over in this tutorial.